The wind tore through Wrangel Island, a remote icebound landmass in the Arctic Circle just 87 miles from Siberia's northeastern coast. It was a place a group of abandoned explorers would fight for their life. This barren island was a place of extremes. It had jagged cliffs, frozen rivers, and a harsh tundra that stretched endlessly beneath the sky. Temperatures at this latitude can reach minus 60 degrees Celsius. Amid this brutal setting stood Ada Blackjack, a 23-year-old Inupiat woman from Nome, Alaska. Unlike others who had come here hoping for conquest and fame, Ada had joined the ill-fated expedition out of desperation. She was driven by poverty and the hope of earning enough money to care for her ailing son, Bennett. And now, here she was, at 23 years old, at one of the most desolate places on Earth, abandoned, with almost no hope of survival and almost zero chance of rescue. Her only hope was 3 men who would try to make a trek across the icy Siberian Strait, battling the ice floes, hoping to make it to mainland Alaska. It had been more than 2 years since Ada had seen civilization. Her hope and fear intertwined, unsure if she would ever see her son again. I just want to thank you guys for joining in today. We have a story about an epic battle for survival in one of the most harshest environments on Earth. I think you're going to like the story. My goal is to keep bringing you guys better and better stories every week. So please, if you can, support the channel by sharing, subscribing, or liking the video. And with your help, I'm going to keep bringing you stories that are fresh and stylish and don't require celebrity endorsements, nicotine supplements, or smelling salts to make it interesting. With that, let's move it on. So before Ada's fateful journey to Wrangel Island, Ada Blackjack life was already marked by hardship and resilience. As a young Inupiat woman living in Alaska, Ada had grown up in an already unforgiving environment. The Inupiat people are indigenous to northern Alaska, and they have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. Through that, they developed extraordinary survival skills and are able to thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Traditionally, they relied on hunting marine mammals like seals, whales, and walrus, alongside caribou and fish. With the arrival of the American and European colonizers in the 19th and 20th centuries, their way of life faced immense disruption. Missionaries and traders introduced new religions, goods, and social structures, while government policies and resource exploitations imposed changes on their lands and traditions that have had lasting effects since. During Ada's time growing up, she faced a time where her culture was being suppressed and she didn't grow up learning the traditional ways of hunting and gathering. She was born in a place called Solomon, Alaska in the winter of 1898. And after her father passes away, she's sent off to a state-run mission school in Unalaska, where she's raised by missionaries rather than her community. And like a lot of indigenous people at that time who were put into kind of white schools, their culture and their connection to their community really suffered. She had a real can-do spirit. And when the opportunity came up in 1921, which she thought would change her circumstances, she jumped all over it. A group of ambitious explorers planned an expedition to a place called Wrangel Island, which was a desolate, unclaimed landmass in the Chukchi Sea, which is named after the Siberian people. Now, this place where they would head to was about 80 miles off the northeastern coast of Siberia and about 300 miles off the coast of Alaska. Now, at that time, the Western and Russian states didn't really have a lot of interest in claiming Arctic territories. So this was still during a time when explorers were finding islands and adding them to a country's inventory. For sure, it was seen as a desolate, not really valuable area. So the expedition to Wrangel Island was basically catalyzed by a combination of geopolitical and exploration fever. So this is also the time when you have Shackleton heading down to Antarctica, or like around that time. And the Arctic territories weren't necessarily seen as overly valuable by the United States, Canada, and Russia. However, people were slowly venturing more and more to that to start claiming territorial islands with the intention of setting up military bases and possibly exploring for resources. At this time, when the crew would venture to Wrangel Island, the Soviet Union hadn't asserted any claim over it, so it was just no man's land, so to speak. The specific island had caught the attention of an explorer from Canada named Stefansson. a well-known Arctic explorer who was said to have very grand aspirations. So this goes back to that historic push in the Arctic to find that Northwest Passage and start laying out military control in the area. So it's less about finding gold at the time and more about finding shipping passages. Now, Stefansson had recruited a team of 4 men for the mission, promising them prestige for their exploration of the area and possible riches upon their return. Now, these men were somewhat untrained for the Arctic challenges. They were drawn more to the lure of adventure than anything, and between Ada and the other 4 people that would be on this crew, not a lot of them had any survival skills. Their lack of preparation and training would soon become a determining factor in their journey into the Arctic. Now, when Ada was asked to join the expedition, she wasn't asked to come on as an explorer, she was asked to be the group's cook. She was initially hesitant, but ultimately she agreed, basically being persuaded by Stefansson's offer of steady pay, which was a rare chance for her to provide what she needed for her son. So the plan was to leave in September of 1921, and it was supposed to be a 2-year expedition. The initial group of the 4 men and Ada would make their way to Wrangel Island to set up a camp so that they could hunt and fish from, so that in 2 years' time, a larger group of people could return to that island and start essentially setting it up as an outpost. During those 2 years, the exploration group was to hold that island, make it livable, and wait for the resupply ship to appear with more supplies and essentially the items needed to set up the town. So in September of 1921, the team does land on Wrangel Island, and it quickly became evident that they were very unprepared for the brutal realities of the Arctic survival. The geography was said to be daunting. Wrangel was a land shaped by extremes. It was bordered by jagged cliffs that plunged into icy waters of the Chukchi Sea, and it also had an interior that was only a mix of rocky tundra, sprawling ice fields, some Arctic plants, birds, but basically desolate and devoid of shelter. There was little vegetation, and what was there was mostly small, hardy Arctic plants that struggled to survive basically anywhere there was permafrost. Wildlife was said to be sparse and elusive, with a few seals along the shoreline, Arctic foxes, and the occasional polar bear. Now, immediately for this crew, Wrangel Island must have seemed less of an opportunity and much more of a future liability. I'm sure at first glance, they're really taken aback as to what they're supposed to do for the next 2 years. Now, as winter set in, the expedition's flaws became painfully apparent. First off, as someone that's been around a lot of cold weather, I'm going to tell you, I don't know what they were thinking ever planning to arrive on Wrangel Island in September. You need that foothold of the little bit of warm weather to set up camp, gather supplies, and do all of these essentially small menial tasks that you can't do in the winter. Like September is on the verge of winter there. Now, not winter by our standards, but in the Arctic, it's getting cold already. This is just evident, very evident right off the bat that this was poor planning. Now, as the first winter would start to set in on these men, right away they realized that their supplies begin to dwindle. And because of the rocky and difficult terrain on the island, hunting and trapping was seeming to prove almost impossible. The men were accustomed to the plentiful wildlife of Alaska and other parts of the country, but this was something new for them. They had arrived with ambitions of trapping foxes and gathering fur before the outpost people arrived, stacking meat, drying fish, you name it, but none of that was available to them. And now they were essentially left in these freezing temperatures in their tents, doing nothing but consuming what little supplies they had. The 4 men, consisting of Alan Crawford, Lorne Knight, Fred Moore, and Milton Gale, endlessly tried to set up a routine of hunting and fishing that could supply them with the food they needed, even at times using the 6 sled dogs they brought to venture out onto the ice, but often with no success. Oh, an interesting thing that I found out researching the story is the crew didn't actually go there completely alone. They brought with them a cat named Vic, who would be there along this journey, just like the cat Mr. Chippy in the Shackleton story. So that's funny to think about. It's something that never set in my mind is that people would be bringing cats on this journey. Initially, the camp sets up a makeshift shelter and they attempt to hunt for food, but obviously this isn't going well. But despite the harsh conditions and the lack of things to hunt and the lack of things to eat, the group wasn't overly worried, but because as part of their plan, Stefansson had agreed to periodically resupply the group with new gear, new food, you name it. They're able to slide through the first winter of 1920 on the supplies and gear they brought with them. But upon the arrival of summer, when their supply ship doesn't arrive, this is when things become truly worrisome. And for the first time, the group starts to feel like their survival is at an imminent threat because their supplies now were running low. They had little success with the fishing and hunting, and they had no idea where Stefansson was. It's at this point that, despite their limited training and experience, they're able to start at least putting together, they're going to have to ration what little food they do have left. And they would make use of what skills they did have to get some success in hunting local wildlife. Now, despite being completely desolate, that doesn't mean they weren't able to forage and hunt for anything. They were able to kill the odd seal, fox, and even some of the seabirds that were around. They didn't have a lot of skills in this way, but it was just enough to keep them from the brink of absolute starvation. At this time, they're still hopeful that maybe that Stefansson had just ran into bad weather and that resupply ships would be on the horizon. But unfortunately for the group, summer would continue to pass, and the first signs of autumn brought with it no ships. And it wouldn't be long before the winter of 1923 would set in. Now, this was truly ominous for the group, now facing their second winter, and this time without supplies. And as the kind of deep set part of winter sinks in, it's just about impossible to move anywhere outside of the shelter. It literally just becomes like a survival in your tent situation, relying on the food that you already had. At this time, burning oil lamps was the main source of heat, as there wasn't a lot of wood or anything like that on the island. And being able to kill a seal does give the group more blubber and more oil to keep themselves heated. When Stefansson had failed to show in the summer of 1922, this killed any hope the crew had. They really started to feel like they were out here on their own. And the chances of Stefansson showing up now that winter was setting in was almost nil. The crew is facing starvation, like they've burned through any supplies they've had. The hunting and fishing that was able to keep them a little bit alive is starting to prove useless. So at this time, the crew had brought 6 dogs with them, and slowly they weren't able to keep them all alive. But by the winter of 1923, a few are still kicking around. And the 4 men decide that they're going to try and make mainland Siberia. They're able to get one of the small boats and use it as like a sled with the dogs. And they're able to gather enough supplies to start making the journey about 80 miles towards the Russian coast. And from there, it's also not going to be as simple as just making land. They're going to have to find help and find a settlement somewhere. So Ada is quite upset with this decision because she doesn't want to be left behind. But the group is insisting that she has to stay behind to hold the outpost. So the men would head out. And it's said that Ada felt a sense of overwhelming despair wash over her, like the absolute finality of everything that she knew disappearing as they went over the horizon. Couldn't imagine how lonely and desolate it felt. She had a hard time coping with it, but she eventually learned to get into the daily grind of going out, checking traps, foraging, keeping the fire warm, and those kind of things. Only a few short weeks later, when Ada's outside doing some work, she starts hearing the bark of dogs, and she swears that she isn't confused as to what she hears. And then it's getting louder, and she realizes, oh, the men are coming back, and she's thinking like it must be a rescue party, and she's super excited. And she ushers the men back into the camp, and that's when they tell her that unfortunately, Lorne Knight had fallen very ill, developed scurvy that had become so bad he was having a hard time walking and his teeth were falling out. This must have been terrifying because everyone knew this was the same fate they would all face if they didn't find adequate food and nutrition soon. Between the scurvy and the terrible ice conditions, they just weren't able to make it any further. So what they're able to do is essentially get Lorne back to camp, and they're going to resupply and make a second push to try and find the mainland somewhere. So the men make the journey out, and Ada has to experience that desolation all over again, watching the 3 men disappear. But now she had a responsibility. It was her job to take care of Knight and make sure that he would survive. Now, Knight had become completely bedridden and weakened from the scurvy. He was no longer able to walk. His teeth had fallen out, and it said that he became completely dependent on Ada. And in the harsh silence of the makeshift shelter, she would feed him, doing what she could to ration portions of whatever she scraped together. She could slowly hear his breathing getting worse and worse. It said that during this time, too, that this guy wasn't exactly being nice to her, but each day, Ada was facing the grim reality that not only her survival was slipping away, but that there was not much she could do to help this guy that was dying right in front of her. She now was taking on the tasks of another person solely alone on limited food and supplies. It said that at one point, though, Ada is able to try and learn how to use the gun that they had at camp and try to shoot some seabirds and things like that. However, she wasn't exactly handy or really good with these survival skills, but as the weeks would stretch on, she would become more and more tired. And slowly, despite her best efforts, Knight's body weakened to the point where he could no longer eat, and he ends up fading away, leaving Ada completely on her own. The group had taken the remaining 2 sled dogs that were still alive with them, so the only thing now keeping Ada company was that little cat named Vic, which is cool in that situation. At least you have something. But in the wake of her abandonment, Ada was overwhelmed with fear. The question kept haunting her. How long could she survive without the return of these men? She knew she didn't have the skills to make it on her own, and from what she could tell, there was no resupply ship coming. Arctic, though beautiful, and though in the summer you get 24-hour sun, it is, again, probably the second harshest place on Earth next to Antarctica. For the first while, it said that Ada was completely paralyzed and she didn't even get out of bed for days. The icy air would sting her lungs every time she tried to crawl outside of the tent. Even the hunger pain wasn't enough to make her get up and go out and face it. She grappled with the crushing loneliness, haunted with the question of how much longer she was going to endure. But once the initial shock wore off, something within her began to shift. She realized that she couldn't sit around and afford to think about her own despair. Not if she wanted to live. Not if she wanted to get home to Bennett, her son. With this resolve, Ada began to face her fears one by one. Her thoughts hardening into a new determination not even she knew she had. She knew that inaction would be her end. Ada made a pivotal decision that she would not give in. Ada gathered up a lot of the supplies that were around the camp, essentially to show up and make herself a better tent with an observation platform on top so she could not only look for rescue, she could keep an eye out for wildlife, for bears, and anything that she could shoot. So that at one point, Ada actually was able to shoot a seal, and she did end up losing it to a polar bear, but she did learn slowly and surely to shoot small birds that were flying around, and she would split these with Vic the cat. Every day, Ada learned more and more about survival. She would scavenge for driftwood and stones to increase insulation around her shelter. She was able to start storing up food from the seals and the birds that she was able to get. And this is a terrifying mindset that she would have been in at the time, but it said that she wasn't even eating what she would catch. She would eat tiny pieces just enough to survive with both her and her cat, but she started preserving and preparing food aside, expecting to be there for the winters ahead. It took her a while to learn how to actually take out a seal. She would be studying the icy shoreline, locating the breathing holes and where these openings in the ice would exist where seals would come out to grab a little bit of air before going back down to catch schooling fish. She would wait quietly, crouch nearby, her heart pounding as she balanced patience and precision. When a seal would finally surface, Ada was there, ready to strike. She would secure her meal, and the exhilaration and the rush that she would get to this really bolstered her spirits to be able to sit back and look at the food that she went out on her own and she hunted and gathered, just like the men could do. She was truly breaking all the stereotypes there was back then, there's no doubt. But anyway, in these quiet moments, Ada really started to discover how much resilience she had inside of herself. And I think you have to have that in that situation because she got it. There was nobody coming for her, and it's not just survival for today. She's putting food away for could be years to come. And that's the part we're going to get to. And that's a little scary. But so just as Ada does begin to find her footing in the unforgiving Arctic landscape, months of isolation weighed down on her, pressing in as tangibly as the ice around her. And even with the warmer summer temperatures starting to come in, or spring temperatures, the ice never really completely breaks there. It's always like there's always ice floes. And even in the summer, it's still not great conditions to survive. She did realize early on that her will to survive had been fueled by a clear purpose, that each day, no matter what, she had to get up and she had to move. Every single small, micro, miniature task was one small increase to a chance of survival. Even with Knight's death, she still had hope that she could make it out of here alive. It said that as winter was loosening its grip, Ada started to face more and more difficulty in catching and finding food. As her supplies are starting to dwindle, she's noticing that fresh game is more and more rare to come by with the changing seasons. The patterns of the wildlife had changed, and now she was feeling that even though warmer temperatures were finding her, she was now scared that she was literally just going to run out of food. She scoured the landscape endlessly, looking for any sign of rescue, for any type of food or scrap she could forage, but she found nothing. She began to feel like the island itself was a living thing intent on killing her. She noticed occasional tracks from polar bears, which seemed to be a constant threat in this harsh land. They were always looking somewhere, either waiting to steal what she killed, or even worse, maybe her. Even if she did manage to find food, she knew the risk it brought with it, as she had witnessed before that killing a seal, in the time that she went back to camp to gather supplies, polar bear had came with its cub and they completely devoured the thing. And she talked often about how isolating the nights were when the 24/7 darkness. So again, hunting and gathering during these times of year, even in the spring, is not that easy because you only have a small limited window of daylight to do absolutely anything in. It was on a frigid morning when she finally awakes, the realization that all of her supplies are gone. She's now run out of her dried fish meat, her dried meat. Everything is depleted. And here she was. Things weren't growing yet, and she feels nothing but panic. She doesn't just want to sit here and wait to starve to death, but she's also going, what choice do I have? This would continue for months. She was slowly wasting away, subsisting on nothing more than the odd bird she was able to trap. Her mind kept turning to the three men. Where were they? They must have reached land by now, and that little bit of hope of those guys out there probably was the thing that got her out of bed every morning. But in the back of her mind, Ada also knew that help should have arrived by now. Something was amiss, but she had to suppress that thought just to keep going. Unbeknownst to Ada, the families and colleagues of the men that had been on Wrangel Island were becoming increasingly concerned. Stefansson had faced logistic issues, harsh weather, and limited resources. It said that this lack of going out to look for them was further driven by the fact that Stefansson kept asserting that the crew would be fine and they'd be able to survive no problem on Wrangel Island. And he kept saying this almost from a point of bias, because the whole selling point of him setting up this expedition was to convince everyone that it wasn't so harsh to live out in places like this. But as Ada sat on Wrangel Island, nearly at starvation's point, finally, enough pressure mounts on Vilmor Stefansson, and he does begin to organize an expedition to go and look for the crew. At first, it said that he was hesitant because he firmly believed the men were capable of self-sufficiency, and that floating ice conditions from the winter breakup were too dangerous to essentially navigate a boat through. Like Titanic style, right? Think of hitting an iceberg. At this point, it had been 2 years, and nobody was buying it, and there was definitely a sense of urgency. So with that pressure, Stefansson sets off with the rescue team led by somebody called Harold Noyce, and they're going to go find and expecting to go and find the outpost on Wrangel Island. I don't think he really thought it was going to be a rescue mission. At this point, it has been 2 years for Ada on Wrangel Island. More than 2 years without any real source of food, any real source of vitamins, and just about complete isolation other than the few animals and the crew that was there with her. Ada was in her tent when all of a sudden she could hear the sound of a foghorn. She's confused, thinking that her mind is playing tricks on her. And it's not until she's able to get up to that observation post can she see part of a ship through the fog. She runs to the edge of the island screaming and shouting, and that's when a rescue party led by Harold Noyce shows up on one of the smaller skiffs. Right away, the rescuers begin to process the scene. They were astonished as Ada stood before them, silent, strong, and wasted away. Many among the rescue crew were struck by a range of emotions. It was said that Stefansson again was perplexed. Others felt guilt, aware that she had been abandoned and forced to survive in the Arctic wilderness alone. The crew quickly offers her food, clothing, and medical care, tending to the physical toll that this journey had taken on her. And that's when Ada tells them that unfortunately Lorne Knight had passed away recently. Ada starts to wonder where the three men are. She's so happy that they finally sent rescue for her. Ada finally asks Noyce, where is the other three guys? That's when he looks at her perplexed, saying, what do you mean? Are they not with you? So that's when it hits her like a ton of bricks, that these three men have disappeared. Stefansson had returned fully expecting to find the camp intact. The last known sighting of these three people is when they left Ada's camp looking for help. Noyce is said to mount a rescue expedition to start looking for Crawford, Gale, and more a few months after Ada's rescue, but no bodies are ever found and no sign whatsoever of the three men has been found to this day. They likely succumbed somewhere out in the frozen ocean, and we'll never get the answers to how or what happened to them, but it's highly unlikely that they survived. And unfortunately, Ada would be the only survivor of the Wrangel Island expedition. Ada was brought back into a world where she became a news sensation. Newspapers were painting her in the light of being an incredible human being of resilience, painting her as the female Robinson Crusoe. They would commend her for her survival in an environment so hostile nobody could survive it. At least no man, but she would because she was a woman. Yet alongside that praise, Ada started to face even darker accusations. Some people starting to say that she hastened Knight's demise and actually was starving him to save supplies for herself to eat. However, those accusations were later backtracked. Following Ada's return, she is reunited with her son. She uses the modest fund that she receives to basically set up a life for herself and her son, who ends up going into state care. He ended up going blind and having a bunch of health issues, but it's still said that Ada lived in the same town and was able to see him on a regular basis. And she would live until 1980s, actually, believe it or not. And again, her reputation everywhere she went was known as this super strong, amazing survival Robinson Crusoe lady. It's said that the cat Vic was rescued with Ada, and he ended up being taken in by members of the rescue team to live out the rest of his little cat life. I think the thing that stuck in everybody's mind at this time was, how could they just be abandoned? And clearly this Stefansson guy had all kinds of excuses to why it happened. Because this is one of his funny survival stories where it's completely caused by man. It's not like they had bad weather and got stuck in. They were just left behind. And I'm guessing at the end of the day it was probably just to save money. And life was harsh back then. I'm glad I'm born when I am. But this story is wild. I couldn't get over it. How people survive in these environments. Because wilderness survival is one thing. When you are lost up in the boreal forest where you've got moose and you've got fish and plenty of firewood, wildlife everywhere, compared to you're being out in these places like Antarctica or the Arctic, where if you're lucky, you're getting some twigs or nothing to burn. And the only thing that you can hope for is running across a seal with enough fat on it that you can burn its fat for heat. Yeah, nothing to build a shelter with. It boggles my mind how Shackleton survived, how this lady survived, especially by herself. And for those three guys that were lost, it's not a surprise. I don't know what it would have done in their situation, because the whole adage of you never want to leave your outpost and kind of go trekking out in a survival situation. But I don't think these people really thought rescue was coming. And sometimes it is appropriate. But unfortunately, I wonder if they would have lived, if they stayed behind. It could have been that they slowly would have just starved to death. But bonus, this is one story where they didn't eat each other, so that's cool. But as we close out on Ada's remarkable journey, I want to leave you with a powerful image of this lone figure standing resilient against the fast, unforgiving Arctic. And to me, it was like her ancestors were there with her. She was taken out of her community as a young person and raised by the state, away from her kind of traditional Inuit hunting and fishing ways. And it was like all of her ancestors still spoke through her. Nobody had showed her how to survive. Nobody had showed her how to do these things. And here she was, completely by herself without an encyclopedia, and she figured it out. And I don't think a lot of people could without somebody looking out for them. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. And reminder, if you want to take this show with you on the go, we're on Spotify and Apple. You can find the link in the channel bio. Thanks, guys.